They felt that an American Indian couldn't be an archaeologist because they felt it might be betraying one's culture. An archaeologist felt that they didn't think an American Indian could be an archaeologist because they didn't believe that I could be objective enough.
This is Meredith for Real, the Curious Introvert, and I'm Meredith. I explore the questions people think but don't ask out loud, either because they're taboo or thanks to cultural hypnosis. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Each episode is different, so bring your ADD and your earbuds and have a look around. Hey Curiositors, it's me, Meredith. Did you know that archaeologists and Native people don't get along? Yeah, I didn't know that either, until I saw this week's guest talk about it on a TV program. He's Choctaw and an archaeologist, and he did a great job of painting the picture of why the two groups have traditionally been at odds. He even shared his own inner conflict with considering the profession and how his friends didn't want him to do it. We also got off on a couple fun tangents too. One about Hawaiian sovereignty, and around the 32-minute mark, he gives a fascinating but probably unpopular opinion on high school education. This is one of the longest episodes I've done, so if you try to fit this in while on your daily commute, you may want to 2x the audio speed to get it all in. Also, I learned about the Native tradition of introducing oneself in your tribal language, so you'll hear how he opens with a greeting in Choctaw. If you've been here a while, you also heard Dan Helms, Chief Skyhorse of the Santa Rosa Creek tribe, do the same in episode 114. And if you have been here a while, thank you for making me a part of your life each week. I want to invite you to participate in a fun promo I'm running in November 2022. Your name will be entered in a weekly drawing for a Meredith for Real beanie when you draft an Apple Podcast review, screenshot it, and send it to me, and then submit the review. Just scroll to the bottom of your screen on your iPhone to see where you can leave both a rating and a review. I'll be drawing every week, and the reviews really help me prove that I have an engaged audience to busy and in high demand guests, because there's no way for outsiders to check how many people are listening to my show. So, they gauge it by the reviews. And finally, if you're new here, welcome. Around here, we press play to get curious, disrupt the algorithm, and grow into better humans. We talk about everything from money to mental health, so bring your ADD and your earbuds and have a look around. There's no specific order to listen to episodes. All right, enjoy the show. If you're an 80s baby like me, Indiana Jones holds a special place in your heart. It taught us that bad guys want riches, and good guys want to put treasures in museums. Reality, however, is more nuanced and probably doesn't involve a chase scene on a moving train. I'm talking about archaeology, specifically the conflict between archaeologists and Native communities, between the science and the heritage, knowledge and belief. My next guest has been studying archaeology for over 50 years. He's a senior consultant at Archaeological and Cultural Education Consultants in Tucson, Arizona, and visiting professor at the Global Institution for Collaborative Research and Education at the Hokkaido University in Japan. He's also a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. He was the second Native person to be president of the Society for American Archaeology and serves as a mediator between anthropological disciplines and Indigenous groups. Today, he's going to share what it's like to work in two worlds and answer the question, why aren't there more Native archaeologists? Anthropologist, archaeologist, liaison of the past and present, Dr. Joe Watkins. Thanks for being here.
Halito Chukma, Sia Joe Watkins, Sia Choctaw, Oklahoma. Hello, my name is Joe Watkins. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and thank you very much, Meredith, for inviting me to be here. Looking forward to our conversation today.
I'm so glad that you're here, or I guess there in Japan at the moment. No slowing down for you after 50 years of studying archaeology.
No, not at all. I find that archaeology has changed quite a bit, but the place it's practiced sometimes brings different and new insights into what's going on. Being here in Japan, it's kind of surprising trying to figure out what time it is someplace else and trying to either count backwards on a clock or count forwards. I always hesitate to say good morning because some of the people I talk with, it's already yesterday or sometimes it's tonight. I trying to keep things straight. It's always a constant struggle, but here in Japan, the archaeology is kind of fun because it's at least 30,000 years old.
Oh, is that all? Just 30,000?
Yeah, as opposed to maybe 2.5 million. But so it's kind of fun. And the people I'm working with here are really interested in the types of issues that have faced indigenous people in other parts of the globe. The Ainu are an indigenous group here in Japan, but they just received recognition from the Japanese government in 2008. So they are trying to come to terms with how other indigenous groups across the world interact not only with their governments, but also with the deep history that archaeology can help them better understand.
I think that's one of the most interesting things about archaeology and anthropology to me is the interconnectedness of it all. You know, how it's not just isolated into one area. It's not just digging in the dirt. You know, it connects everyone. It's about people and the lives, the real lives that they lived, and connecting that to our real lives that we live. And it affects policy and it affects the way that we view one another. I think there's so much there. That's why I love this subject so much. And I'm so inspired by people in the field doing the thing like you are. And I heard that, tell me if this is true, that yeah, you look nervous all of a sudden.
Yes.
I heard that Native activist and author Vine Deloria Jr. had a big impact on your career.
He did. I was very glad to meet Vine Deloria later on in his career, in my career. But in 1969, just as I had graduated from high school and just before I started at the University of Oklahoma in archaeology, I happened to read excerpts of his book, Custer Died for Your Sins, in the August issue of Playboy magazine. And that just, I read the magazine for the articles.
Right.
Yes. But I did read that chapter, and I bought the book. I read the book, and it had a great deal of influence because at that time, archaeologists, anyone who actually read the book, were afraid that they kept saying, well, if American Indians only knew what we did and what we could give them, they would be glad for us to do archaeology. And they never really understood that American Indians oftentimes saw archaeology as a political act that was in some ways perceived to remove the history of this continent from the descendants of those who created it. And also it was seen that the archaeologists might be the ones giving them their history. So there was already a point of conflict in the 1960s. And I kind of thought, well, that's not what I'm going to do. So I thought that I wanted to work actually go to Europe, Southwestern Europe, and dig up the ancestors of the American archaeologists and see how well they liked it. But I did get to spend 1 year or one summer in Southwest France, but I never did become a European archaeologist.
And your friends were against you becoming an archaeologist. Was it for the same reasons that you just said, or did they have other motives?
I think it was probably a combination of the two. I think they felt that that an American Indian couldn't be an archaeologist because they felt it might be betraying one's culture. And archaeologists felt that they didn't think an American Indian could be an archaeologist because they didn't believe that I could be objective enough. So there was always that, always in the middle. It's like walking on a barbed wire. You have to be kind of careful that you don't misstep and accidentally slide and hurt yourself.
What did your grandmother think?
Well, my grandmother was, at that time, my grandmother didn't really think much. But when I was 10 years old, I found an archaic projectile point about 6,000 years old. I found it on our family homestead in southeastern Oklahoma, and I showed it to my grandmother. She didn't really speak English, and I only spoke enough Choctaw to get my face slapped on occasionally. But I had a cousin who was fully bilingual. She explained that my grandmother recognized that projectile point didn't belong to the deep history of the Choctaw, but it belonged to those who had lived in the area before the Choctaw moved in the 1830s and 1840s. But she felt that it was very important that that unwritten history not get lost. So when I turned 17 and started thinking about, well, I really couldn't become a paleontologist and I couldn't go to Mongolia and excavate dinosaur egg nests, then I thought, well, archaeology, maybe that'll be fun. So I started doing archaeology and really I try to believe that I do try to help groups gather together whatever unwritten history that they might have. I don't believe that I tell them their history, but that I do try to make some of that information available to either complement their own or supplement what it is that they already have.
I wonder if I'm naive in thinking that from the point of view that you just said, conveying that unwritten history, not letting the ancient cultures become lost in time. I feel like that's what archaeologists want, and that's what Native people want. But I suspect I may just be naive in thinking that. Is that true? Am I just naive in thinking that they want the same thing?
No, I believe that they do want the same thing. I think that archaeologists see things primarily from a universalist, broader perspective about the deep history of humanity, the deep history of our time here on this earth, from as far back as we might possibly be able to craft it until as far in the future as we possibly can. American Indians, in many regards and in many cultures, share some similar ideas and similar thoughts. American Indians definitely want to maintain their culture. They want to maintain their histories. They want their children to recognize what their ancestors had gone through. But there are some things that American Indian cultures don't really care to share. There are a lot of things that they will, but there are some things that they like to hold more closely to themselves. So I think that as you perceive that there is quite a few shared goals, some archaeologists recognize that and still believe that if we could just convince American Indians that we have these lofty ideas and that they're very much complementary to what the American Indian groups think, then they would welcome us with open arms. But some archaeologists just don't really know how to approach it, I guess.
What have been some examples in the past of conflicts between the two groups? Just to kind of paint a picture of, someone who maybe like me is like, can't we all just be friends?
There actually have been positives and negatives. I knew some archaeologists in the late 60s who were working with a tribe in Utah. They were doing some work for the tribe. And as they encountered any sets of human remains, the archaeologists would leave them in the ground, or they would do very basic field research and get them out of the way of the construction so that they wouldn't be destroyed. And then they reburied them. And so they were working with the tribe for the benefit of the tribe and doing things in the way that the tribe wished. Of course, that's one of the few very positive examples from that time period. There's been a lot of conflict, primarily the more recent and probably the more publicized one has been with a set of human remains called the Ancient One, or Kennewick Man, discovered in the mid-1990s on the Columbia River. That went so far as to require a court case. The tribes in the area, 6 tribes, wanted the human remains reburied. The Corps of Engineers, on whose land the materials were found, were proposing to rebury it under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. But then 6 scientists sued to stop the repatriation, went to court. The court found that the Corps of Engineers could not repatriate because those remains, due to a minor technicality, could not be considered Native American under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. So that created a great deal of hostility between the tribes, at least in the Northwest Coast, and archaeology, anthropology, biological anthropology. And it oftentimes has been used as a rallying point by tribes who were wanting to have materials repatriated and returned. So it ended on a good note, I suppose. The human remains were ultimately reburied I believe it was in 2016. Actually, it was on my birthday, February 18th, in 2016. They were reburied not as a result of any repatriation law, but it was reburied because of a minor rider that was put in a bill in Congress. So that probably was the most public, most contentious conflict. But there have been others, quite a few across the United States. I could probably talk for a couple of days about a few more, but probably not a good good use of our time. Really.
Well, I mean, that example you gave is really good because it talks about a hot button, which is the treatment of remains. Well, you mentioned in a lecture that was top of the list of grievances among Native people, that the way the archaeologists treat remains. Help me understand why, in the case of the one that you just mentioned, why were the scientists wanting so badly to not have the body buried? And why were the Native people so passionate about having it buried? Since you are exactly in the middle of those two groups, I feel like you're the right person to ask this question.
Okay, well, the importance of the set of human remains to science was based on 2 things. One, its age. It was found to be about more than 9,000 years old, which would place it as one of the earliest sets of human remains in North America. And the second reason was it was a nearly complete skeleton. It wasn't just a piece of bone here and a piece of bone there. When it was uncovered, the initial anthropologist who looked at it, James Chatters, said that he thought the skull shape made it look like a European skull. And so he thought it was maybe the remains of a farmer from the 1890s, a pioneer maybe. But he found a small piece of a projectile point in the hip bone of the individual. And that kind of surprised him. Then he got a little piece of bone and sent it off for dating. And when it came back at more than 9,000 years old, it floored him, because he was not expecting individuals of that age to have the morphological characteristics of the skull that they had. They were expecting it to look more like American Indians, a little bit broader, a little rounder, both on top and the face and such. And when it didn't, he was trying to figure out, well, why? And so the scientists who wanted to study the sets of human remains said that it was really important, an important way of contributing, they said, to the history of the peopling of North America, the New World. American Indian tribes in that area said, well, we don't need scientists to tell us our history. We already know it. And that they also believed that human remains, once buried, should not be disturbed. They felt that once they were put either in the ground or as part of a sky burial, they should be left alone for time immemorial. Now, the scientists, when they looked at and did take went out and looked at the site where the materials had been found, they recognized that the human remains, the person known as the Ancient One, had been buried, purposefully buried, with his head about 4 to 6 inches higher than his feet. His head was placed upstream, and they could tell this by looking at the excavation site and where the materials came from. So it wasn't just like this individual had been walking along and died and just fell in place and that his body just decomposed. It was ceremonially, or at least socially, placed in a burial position in the ground. So the tribe saw that as, even though they may not have known what the actual ceremony was at the time, they did think he had been ceremonially placed. So they felt, therefore, that he shouldn't have been disturbed and that he needed to be placed back into the earth as soon as possible. So that's just very basic outline of what the conflicts were.
I think that illustrates it pretty clearly. Is there a way for both parties to get what they want in a situation like that? Can the data that scientists hope to extract from a great intact skeleton be acquired in the field and then, buried soon after? Is there some sort of middle ground here, or will it always be a this or that?
I'm not certain it'll always be a this or a that in the future. Right now, there are a lot of tribes that more than 200 federally recognized tribes have their own tribal historic preservation office. And those individuals who are within those offices work for the benefit of the tribe, and they recognize that even though archaeology may have some bad points to it, that it's much better for the tribe itself to control what's being done on the archaeology on their lands than it is to rely on some outsider to come in and do archaeology, perhaps without too much tribal involvement. So there has been a bit of growth in that regard. More and more, there are people who are more tribal people who are biological anthropologists and recognize that they too have a role in trying to help tribes recognize the utility that some of this information might be either now or in the future. In the past, the Wichita tribe used to work with the Smithsonian Institution because they thought that if there were basic characteristics in human remains that could be identified as Wichita, then it might help them further expand their Aboriginal territories. So they saw that as a means of a utility, because if human remains were found outside of where they currently live, they could say, well, we used to live here in the past, and so we should have more consultation about any sorts of projects going on in those areas. So in some ways, it became a little bit of a political means as well. The Pawnee were very much involved in similar ideas. Currently, I think that much of what we are learning requires a little bit of destructive analysis. Much of the DNA information, the ancient DNA information that we are getting, it's giving us a better picture of some of the broad stories. We recognize that there were 2, 3, maybe as many as 5 different migrations into North America. Initially, it was thought that they came through a giant corridor that didn't have ice in it, but now we recognize that, well, some people probably did, others may not have. It looks like there might have been a coastal route that was a little bit easier and maybe a little bit earlier. So we're finding that there are some fascinating scientific stories that DNA is offered to tell us. But one thing I've always said is that DNA does not equate to culture. So even though the scientists can say, well, the DNA tells us this, tribal people recognize that, well, cultures change over time. And the first group of people who came into North America probably were not Native American, at least not in my opinion. But the first generation born here they were the Native Americans. And so regardless of where our great, 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 great 500 generation great ancestors may have started out, once they got to North America, then they became American Indian, Native American. So there were some people, some of the scientists initially said that the ancient one, Kennewick man, looked more like Ainu, or looked more closely related to today's Ainu population here in Japan. And because of that, there was someone here in Japan who said, well, can we repatriate the ancient one and rebury him here?
Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness.
Yeah, well, NAGPRA does not apply to outside of the United States. So the answer, of course, was no. But again, that just goes to show some of the political uses that scientists' pronouncements, perhaps inadvertent pronouncements, could be put.
And I could see where, I'm putting myself in the shoes of a Native person who heard, stories from my grandmother, let's say, and she heard them from her grandmother. And we have all these beautiful traditions and stories that are passed down. And then to have like a non-Native scientist come in, anthropologist, archaeologist, say, oh, by the way, you were right. Like, I could see where that would feel really degrading, like pandering, it wouldn't feel good. And so I could see where there would be desired distance between those two, but I'm happy to hear that there's collaboration. I wanted to touch on something that you said about the land, because we were referring to land sovereignty basically, right?
Right, yes.
But I just learned that in Hawaii, the natives don't have any sovereignty over the land. So how would discoveries in Hawaii work?
Well, there's been a movement in Hawaii to try to establish lands. Of course, Hawaii's different because it was a kingdom.
Right.
It was a native kingdom. It was overthrown by a few individuals, some very wealthy individuals, conquered by the United States. It was different. So I'm not sure how Hawaiian sovereignty is going to work. There has been a move. They're attempting to massage existing federal law and try to apply it in Hawaii. Not being a native Hawaiian, I'm not certain really what's going on yet. I've visited with some native Hawaiians it's been 3 or 4 weeks ago now. We had a few conversations, some ideas about how to try to make it work. But right now they're working against more than 100 years of precedent. So they're trying to figure out how to go about it. They're working at it in a cultural way, in that they have a lot of native Hawaiian schools that fully instruct in the native Hawaiian language. They're trying to look at language sovereignty and all those issues, and then perhaps trying to move beyond that. There might be possible ways. There are government-owned facilities or lands that the government has used in the past that might be amenable to revert to native Hawaiian. Of course, right now there's no real singular native Hawaiian organization, no native Hawaiian government. Perhaps something like a native Hawaiian parliament might be a good idea, somewhere where they could get elected officials from various communities among the different islands as a government. Something like maybe the Sami parliament in Sweden and Finland. That might be a possibility, but I'm not certain.
Hey, Curiositors, just a quick pause to show gratitude to our sponsors and give you some special deals. If you ever wonder where I find guests for the show, the answer is it varies a lot. And since it's something that gets asked a lot, I started including the backstory of each episode in my Monday emails. And then on Saturday, I share cliff notes and clickable links in case what you heard was so good you wish you could have taken notes. If you want to be included, text REAL to 66866 if you're in the US, or go to meredithforreal.com if you're elsewhere. If you've got backyard barbecue plans for 2022, but mosquitoes are not invited, I recommend Insect. I've been using their pest control service for several years now. They have a certified mosquito identification specialist on staff, and pollinator care is always top of mind. If you live in the Florida Panhandle or the Gulf Coast of Alabama, give them a call, ensec.net. If you watch the show on YouTube, then you see the beautiful backdrop of Trader John's, the exhibit where I record the show inside the Pensacola Museum of History. This is just one museum under the umbrella of the UWF Historic Trust. If you're planning a trip to Pensacola and need an indoor activity option, pick up a ticket. It's good for a whole week. Get your tickets in person so you can show the agent one of my emails and get $2 off an adult ticket. Now back to the show. Remember to stay till the end where I give you a sneak peek of next week's episode. It's really interesting how so many of what we're talking about, it comes back to policy. It's so hard to keep politics out of this because, that's kind of, when you think about how did Hawaii become part of the U.S.? Well, yeah, it was a sovereign kingdom and it was overthrown by the U.S., largely to protect American business interests. So it's like, it's always so sticky. And from, you're an educator. So from an educator perspective, I'm curious what you would want to see different in both, high school, especially high school. Let's just keep it at high school, actually, because not everyone goes to college. But, and I'm asking this question because, oh God, I feel like half of my freaking adult life is relearning history. I'm like, I grew up in Nebraska. Excuse me, all I heard about was the stupid covered wagons. And we missed such a beautiful opportunity to learn about the native people there. And, we had so many opportunities totally missed. Hawaii, all I learned is that it was the 50th state. That was it. That was all that I learned. I literally did not know that it was a sovereign kingdom with a queen who was globally respected and invited to Queen Victoria's Jubilee. Until last week. Last week, of course I did a podcast episode about it. So that's like really it's a nice little benefit of doing this is I have a reason to dive into some of these subjects. But I can see from a policy perspective why it would be important for future policymakers to learn history in a more complete way. But I would love to hear what you think as an educator, from an educator's point of view. How would you propose going about making history a more complete subject at a high school level, even though I know you're not a high school educator?
I do believe it's difficult because high school is generally created to help people learn how to learn, one thing. And it's also meant to instill a nationalist pride. We're American. I'm proud to be an American. Here's American history. But generally, the American history that's presented is a mainstream history. It's the history of the people who founded this country, the people who fought against England to take over this country. And so it's a mechanism to instill patriotic pride. And it's in many ways, I hate to say, well, no, I don't hate to say this. In many ways, it's propaganda. It's based to create people who can accept what the rulers, the governors or elected officials or president, what they believe is best for the country. As an American Indian growing up, I always recognized that it was a partial history. In Oklahoma, every day in November 17th, the state of Oklahoma celebrates the land run. The Oklahoma Land Run was a time when various portions of the state of Oklahoma were opened up to settlement to the white settlers. And so that was the beginning of Oklahoma's land base, if you will. And so many times the grade schools would have a mock land run. They would start on one side of the playground and everybody would yell and scream and dressed up as pioneers and run across and stake out their claim. So that was experiencing the state history. Well, no one really talked about the impact of that on the American Indian tribes whose land that was. The federal government at the time, 1889, said, well, you don't need this much land. You're not using it. You're not farmers. You're not growing it. So you don't need the land. We'll open it up to the people who can tame it, the people who can make use of it, and the people back east who don't have land of their own. So there was always that conflict. And anytime any American Indian that I know of complained about it, the teachers, punished them, basically, in many ways. And so it was anytime we started looking at the non-national history, we got in trouble. So I believe that it's very important that something more than just one day. The only time I got any Indian history was the day before Thanksgiving. And then we learned about the first Thanksgiving. We learned about Squanto and the Pilgrims and how Squanto taught the Pilgrims how to bury a fish with their seeds so that it would grow better, and corn and beans and squash together and everything. So we didn't learn American Indian history, at least not in grade school. In high school, we had maybe a week. In Oklahoma, it was primarily talking about the 5 civilized tribes and the Trails of Tears. So we are very incomplete. And of course, each state has its own sets of requirements. So only rarely is American Indian history taught. And quite often what is taught is only partially correct. At this point in time, I do know that many American high schools teach students to be able to take standardized tests just to prove that they have limited or at least a minimal level of education. I don't know well enough about how more advanced high schools, what classes they offer or anything. So I think that part of the issue with public education is that it is oriented more toward a nationalist goal of teaching everybody a very shared set of information so that we can all feel like we all belong to the same culture.
And so we will be willing to fight in war, in my opinion.
So that we'll be able to fight to protect the social fabric that we all are a part of. Whatever the reasons that may be, blind patriotism is such a scary thing. Mm-hmm. And, that's some of the things that we've seen in some of the political issues that have happened across the country in the previous 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and I don't think it's, unique to the United States. I think every country has that temptation, whether it's taught to them or not. It's just part, I think, of our nature to gather with and support people that are like ourselves. But when it comes to, learning about the past, I do think that bigger picture of history would benefit everyone. And so as we wrap up, I would love for you to weigh in on why you feel that it's important for the world to hear about Native history from Native people.
Certainly. I think that it's quite easy to find any number of books about American history, Japanese history, Russian history, global history on a broad sense. The idea that Native history is somehow lessened by the fact that there haven't been people who have chosen to take the time to write it down for everybody else. In many ways, Native history is a microcosm of global history in that every individual tribe had its own stories about the people that it interacted with. They have a different perspective. In some regards, they were the conqueror. We do know that tribes had battles, had wars, and fought with each other over sometimes little issues, sometimes major issues like food, horses, and women and children. And so to be able to have access to Native histories gives us a broader picture of what we as humans, how we interact with each other, the kinds of ways we choose to handle stress, the kind of ways we choose to welcome other people on occasion. Some tribes captured people for slaves. Other tribes adopted people from other tribes in order to create coalitions. So we know that Native histories span the gamut from dictatorships almost to total socialist republics. So it's not like any history that we encounter today is something that hasn't been experienced by native groups across the globe. I think part of the issue is that many of the native groups have been marginalized so much and so often that some of those groups have some very new and improved ways of dealing with of living in those marginalized environments. In the Southwest, as climate change came to a head in the 1200s, we found that there were people who were creating what are called rock gardens, in that they would put rocks fairly closely spaced together in the areas in some of their field gardens, because they found that the rocks would heat up in the daytime and cool down at night, and it would draw dew and moisture from the atmosphere, much more so than just bare ground. And so that moisture would contribute to the moisture that the plants needed to grow. And so they knew that that was a way to increase not only the amount of plants that they could grow, but to lengthen the growing season, both in the beginnings, at the front, and at the end. So if we could take that sort of information and apply it today, we might not have as much issue with climate change that we are currently experiencing. I'm not certain to what extent this would work on a global scale, but we know at least on a local geographical scale, it might work. So we do recognize that there's some very definite native knowledge that can be beneficial. And we also recognize that native histories offer just another facet to the entire global picture about what it means to be human and what it has meant to be human since 2 million years ago, 100,000 years, however far back in time you want to go.
That is, I couldn't word that any better. The thought about the technology, the humanity, those are all things that we really value right now. So I hope that in the future, those values will, expand into collaborative efforts with Native people as we continue to learn more together. But that just could be the hippie in me trying to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. So thank you, as one does. Thank you so much for this talk. I know that you and your wife wrote a book, correct, for archaeology students. Can you share about that?
Sure. The book title is called The Anthropology Student's Guide from Student to a Career. Or it's the Anthropology Graduate's Guide from Student to a Career. And it was set up primarily to help students translate the knowledges that they've gained as a student and use that to help them move into a professional career. It's set up in a series of chapters that helps instruct students how to do particular presentations, how to focus on gaining knowledge, how to gain experience, how to craft a vita, or how to dress for an interview, or how to interact with other students and professors and such. I've known that some schools have used it as part of the capstone courses, so that their college graduates, their seniors, take it with them, and they use it to help put together a portfolio that they can use both to apply for jobs or to apply to graduate school. We are in the process of trying to find time, 1,200 miles apart, to craft a second edition of it. As we recognize, we published it in 2012. We recognize that in the past 10 years, there have been some major technological advances. If anything, COVID taught us over the last 2 years that much of what we used to do face-to-face can be done through technology. Perhaps not as well. It's a little bit more stilted, a little bit more problematic. We don't have the same sorts of visual clues that we might have. But so we need to address that in the book. We need to talk about the growth of now when you apply for a job, rarely do you send a letter and a paper copy and copies of your publications. Now you get online and you go to a particular website that a university may have, and you have to download this and you have to upload that, and you have to put in links to individual professors who will do an electronic letter of support for you. So things have gone electronic, and we need to address those in the book.
And where could people find it if they wanted to purchase it?
Right now, you can get it on Amazon. It's published by Routledge Press. If you just Google the Anthropology Graduate's Guide, you should be able to find it. Carol Ellick and Joe Watkins are the authors on it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this chat. Thank you for making time.
Well, you're more than welcome, Meredith, and thank you for making time yourself. It's my morning here, so I'm just really getting started, and I know it's evening or afternoon there. So again, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you've loved a couple episodes of this show, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or the Good Pods app. If you liked this episode, you'll also like the one I did with the man who didn't find out he was Indigenous royalty until he was in his 50s, episode 114. Stay tuned next week when I talk with an expert on how our expectation of constant happiness can be a source of chronic stress.